Hey there friends, it's Kodiak here, welcome back to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're diving back into V Rising and sharing our rankings for every spell in the game. If you've been following the channel, you've most likely seen one of our individual skill tree ranking videos. Well, this is a supercut, a compilation of all of those videos put together in one place. If you do want to check out any of those skill tree breakdowns, we've left links in the description below. This is going to be a bit of a longer video since it's taking 5 videos and smashing them into one, but we did want to have a singular resource for anyone new to V Rising looking to learn more about a specific spell. With that out of the way, let's dive in to the rankings. As always, when doing a ranking video here on the channel, I like to start by making it crystal clear. This type of content, these rankings are subjective. What we think is good or bad may not be what you think is good or bad, and that's fine. We always appreciate you letting us know in the comments, and in many cases, you guys actually change our minds on a ranking, so let's just start on the same page before we dive in. Now, to do a proper rankings video, at least in our eyes, you have to establish some sort of ground rules, something to keep us honest about how and why we're ranking things the way that we did. For our V Rising series, we're keeping things relatively simple, focusing on 3 key areas: effectiveness in PvE, effectiveness in PvP, and utility. All of the abilities are running through that filter and hopefully allows us to more accurately characterize everything we're talking about. The goal is for us to reveal each rank and you guys to agree, or at least be close. So with the disclaimer out of the way and the ground rules established, let's break it all down with the rankings. First on our list is Blood Rage. This ability allows players to shield themselves and nearby allies for 110% of the caster's spell power and increase attack speed by 25% for 4.5 seconds. To get Blood Rage, players need to defeat the V-Blood unit Rufus the Foreman at the Bandit logging camp in central Farbane Woods. When push comes to shove, this is a clear case of an early ability you'll have access to that might be fine in the early game, but just lags behind something awful in the mid to late game. In PvE, there is some value in the shielding component, as we'll talk about with other abilities, but Blood Rage's 110% is paltry compared to better options. Its other effect, that 25% attack speed bonus, is fine, but at the end of the day, it's only really impacting your basic attacks, which honestly aren't that important mid to late game. You're going to lead with everything else, your weapon abilities and spells. The added bonus of being able to buff your allies is a nice touch, but ultimately, Blood Rage just suffers from a lack of viability long term, which is why it gets a D rank. Next on our list is Blood Rite. This allows players to block melee and projectile attacks for 1.5 seconds. If successful, the blocking player receives 30% of their spell power back as a heal and triggers a wave of energy that pushes the attackers away, dealing 100% magic damage. Blood Rite is accessible right from the start of the game and is one of the 2 standard abilities every player has access to during the tutorial process. Much like Blood Rage, this ability just doesn't stand up long term. I would say it's got an even shorter shelf life because it's just not that viable in most situations. Yes, it gives you a guaranteed way to block an attack, and that's really its saving grace because you can use it to great effect if your timing is right. But in both PvE and PvP, it just doesn't stack up against the onslaught of other abilities, especially other counters and shields. One of the issues too is that Blood Rite's healing component scales off your spell power, not the actual attack. So unless you invest heavily, you're not seeing a whole lot of impact. Long story short, this is an interesting ability on paper, but fails to really thrive in the game because it's just not that good, and for that reason, we're giving it a D rank. The next ability, Crimson Aegis, allows players to apply a shield to themselves or a targeted ally for 200% of the caster's spell power. When applied, the shield also knocks back any enemies nearby. To get Crimson Aegis, you need to defeat the V-Blood unit Grayson the Armorer at the Bandit Armory in central Farbane Woods. While purely a defensive ability, Crimson Aegis scales incredibly well long term, and while there are slightly better versions of similar types of abilities, getting Crimson Aegis early is huge, especially when confronting challenging V-Blood units or players in PvP. It really boils down to 2 things, that 200% spell power shield and the utility of being able to control the knockback. If you focus on boosting your spell power, you'll really see the effects of that 200% shield. On the other hand, the flexibility to choose when to trigger a knockback is also great. It's a really potent tool in a variety of situations, which is why Crimson Aegis is getting an A rank. Next up is Sanguine Coil, a skill shot spell that allows you to launch a projectile that deals 75% magic damage and leech 40% health on an enemy hit. If used on an ally instead of an enemy, it heals the ally for 100% and the caster for 40% of their spell power. I should also point out that you get 3 charges with this spell. To unlock Sanguine Coil, you need to kill the V-Blood unit Meredith the Bright Archer in the Haunted Iron Mines in southern Dunley farmlands. Be warned, there is also an undead commander as well as a ton of undead in the mines, and they'll fight any humans they run across, and it can get a little chaotic. Sanguine Coil is a really interesting ability, one that I actually used quite a bit during progression. I think my favorite aspect of it is the multiple charges, because it gives you multiple options to make an impact, and because each attack triggers some sort of self-healing, it's providing both damage and utility. The one real drawback here is the lack of damage. That 75% is just weak compared to other spells in the game, and while some folks might not mind, it becomes a big issue the later you get into V-Rising. Ultimately, it comes down to what you want out of your spells, and for the most part, people are either going to lean further into offensive or further into defensive, which puts Sanguine Coil in this weird middle space. We should also point out that with a 100% Scholar blood buff, this spell heals for much more, now has a chance to be a free cast, but again, it's all dependent on getting high blood buffs consistently. Other spells deal more damage or heal for more right out of the gate, so it gets lost in the shuffle, and for that reason, we're giving the ability a B rank. Our next ability, Shadowbolt, is pretty standard fare. The single cast projectile deals 200% magic damage and inflicts a 1-second fading snare, which means it's more effective at the start but wears off quickly. This is one of the first abilities you get as a player in V-Rising, so it's not connected to any V-Blood units. It's hard to bash any ability because it's simple, but sometimes simple is effective, and that's really the case with Shadowbolt. Its 200% magic damage is solid, and while it's unclear exactly how magic damage scales off of spell power, you just need to use the ability a few times to realize it gets the job done. The added value of a short snare is really nice, but not necessarily a game changer. It's great in PvP for quickly slowing down an enemy that might be chasing you, or in PvE giving you a second to reposition, but it's on the weaker end of the utility spectrum. Ultimately, this is a good introductory skill that stays relevant throughout most of the game, but eventually gets outshined, and for that reason, we gave it a C rank. Our next ability, Veil of Blood, is the Blood Tree's travel skill. This allows you to dash towards a given direction, avoiding attacks for 2.2 seconds. When breaking out of the pseudo-stealth, the next attack deals 25% bonus damage and heals for 5% of your maximum health. This is the first travel skill players get in the game and doesn't need to be unlocked. You get it almost instantly during the first 30 minutes of your V-Rising experience. Now let me just say this, I don't hate Veil of Blood. It's a really good foundational skill that allows players movement and recovery, and that's a really important aspect of the game early on. The thing about Veil of Blood is, though, it doesn't really wow you with its effects. You get the movement speed, okay, all travel skills have that. You get bonus damage, and let's be honest, 25% on a primary attack isn't going to add much to the equation, especially considering most others have that as well. And finally, you get a 5% heal based on your max HP. This is probably the best aspect of the ability, but even still, once you tap into different blood types, potions, and other ways of recovery, this becomes such a non-factor. It's not a bad move, like I said, but it's also not stellar, which is why it gets a C rank. Our final two abilities are both blood-specific ultimates. Crimson Beam is most likely the first one that you'll unlock. When cast, you'll channel a beam of energy that deals 150% magic damage to enemies hit and heals allies for 100% of your spell power per second, up to 4 seconds. Each target that you hit with the beam heals you for 25% of your spell power. To unlock Crimson Beam, you need to kill the V-Blood unit Raziel the Shepherd in the main building of the Dunley Monastery, and word of warning, you will need holy resistance if you hope to survive. All in all, I really like this ability. It's one of the ultimates I kept in rotation for quite a while, as I found the balance of damage and healing to be pretty solid. It felt like an ultimate ability, and that's really crucial when dealing with these critical moves. If they don't feel impactful, they definitely don't deserve to be used, but Crimson Beam manages to hit its mark. However, the ability isn't perfect, and if we look at it from both a PvE and PvP perspective, it's actually pretty flawed in a PvP setting. The ability causes the player to become stationary, and because its rotation speed isn't great, a smart combatant can dodge the beam and then wail on the player without fear of repercussion. This is a huge blind spot in the ability's effectiveness, but really doesn't come into the picture unless you consider PvP. It is good, and everyone should try out Crimson Beam for at least a little bit, but at the end of the day, we have to stay true to our process, which is why Crimson Beam is getting a B rank. Our final blood ability is Heart Strike. This is a powerful ultimate that allows players to dash forward in a straight line, dealing 150% magic damage as well as healing the player for 150% of their spell power over 3.5 seconds. Additionally, for every target hit with the initial dash, a Blood Nova will explode shortly after, dealing 150% magic damage to them and nearby targets. To get Heart Strike, you'll need to kill the V-Blood unit Wilfred the Werewolf Chief in Gloomgrave Village. A special note, you can only engage with Wilfred during the night. If you go to the village during the day, he'll be in his human form. Straight up, Heart Strike is awesome, an incredibly potent ability in both PvE and PvP that provides superb damage, mobility, or the means to reposition, as well as recovery. It checks off all the boxes and really doesn't have a downside. The one real argument you could make is that the ability performs much better with multiple targets, and if you manage to line up a bunch of enemies and trigger the Blood Nova, it's game over. The damage is insane, but even on a single target encounter, bosses, or a singular PvP engagement, it still lights out. The percentages for both damage and healing is generous, and the added mobility factor actually weighs in quite a bit because you can use this ultimate as a means of also repositioning and getting in on a better spot for an engagement. It's a great ability everyone should work into their build at some point, which is why we're giving it an S rank. Our first ability, Corpse Explosion, gives players their first taste of the Unholy skill tree. When triggered, players can raise a pile of bones below that explodes at a targeted location, dealing 125% magic damage and applying a fading snare that lasts 1 second. To unlock this ability, players will need to kill Goreswine the Ravager in the southern part of Farbane Woods. Goreswine does patrol between the desecrated graveyard and the infested graveyard, so you might have to check multiple places to track him down. As an introductory move, Corpse Explosion is okay, but other than introducing players to the Unholy skill tree, it falls pretty flat in terms of effectiveness. While it is one of a small handful of true AoE abilities, the delay between cast and impact just leaves too much room for error. In both PvE and PvP, enemies can simply dodge the ability, and because of the lackluster 125% damage, it's hard to justify using one of your precious ability slots on such a subpar move. On paper, it seems like an okay ability, but in practice, there are just too many flaws, which is why it's getting a D rank. The next ability, Pestilence, allows players to launch a wave of 3 unholy projectiles that each deal 40% magic damage, knocks targets back, and inflicts Amplify that increases damage taken by 25% for 5 seconds. To unlock Pestilence, players will need to kill the V-Blood unit Nikolaus the Fallen. He is located at the top of the Forgotten Cemetery in central Farbane Woods. A word of warning, this boss summons a ton of minor skeletons to aid in the fight and proves to be one of the earlier challenges when it comes to V-Blood units. Pestilence succeeds where Corpse Explosion fails for one key reason: the damage amp associated with the ability. That extra 25% damage taken debuff you can apply to enemies is a game changer and makes Pestilence much more valuable as an ability. Sadly, that's really the only strong aspect of the move. The damage is lacking, and unless you're in melee range and use the ability as a shotgun, you'll rarely hit all 3 projectiles on a single target. Still, if you can capitalize on the damage amp and understand how best to use Pestilence to make it work in combat, the ability is decent enough, which is why it's getting a B rank. Our next ability, Purgatory, allows players to call down a pillar of energy that slows enemies in an area for 1 second and heals allies for 40% of the player's spell power. After 1.2 seconds, the pillar erupts in a powerful burst of energy, dealing 75% magic damage to enemies and healing allies for 75% of your spell power. To unlock Purgatory, players will need to defeat Christina the Sun Priestess, who's found patrolling around Dawnbreak Village in the Dunley farmlands. It's best to track her using the Blood Altar, as she moves around quite a bit and is difficult to locate. Hands down, Purgatory is one of the best abilities in V Rising, full stop. There are a few things at play here. First is the healing component. In late game PvE encounters and pretty much all PvP encounters, this is going to be a huge factor in your success. Not only do you get healed during the initial cast, but you also catch it again once the ability's explosion triggers. That initial cast is also when the slow effect is applied, which provides players with pretty remarkable utility in PvP encounters. Purgatory also features a decent size AoE and an okay damage component, which helps round it out. Top to bottom, this is one of the most fully realized abilities in the game, which is why Purgatory is getting an S rank. The next ability is quite different, but still interesting. When cast, Unstable Mosquito summons a mosquito that chases down an enemy and explodes after 1 second. This deals 60% magic damage in an area and inflicts Amplify that increases damage taken by 25% for 5 seconds. To unlock Unstable Mosquito, players need to kill the V-Blood unit, Matka, the Curse Weaver, and the Cursed Forest. She's one of the final bosses currently in the game and does require quite a bit of skill to knock off. Now I applaud Stunlock for doing something a bit different with Unstable Mosquito. It's not a perfect ability, but it's interesting, and that at least gives us something to talk about. There are a few issues here. The first is that the explosion is delayed, which causes problems if the target isn't frozen or incapacitated. That being said, in conjunction with its short range, it's a pretty easy ability to dodge in PvP. There are some one-shot builds that use Unstable Mosquito in conjunction with a stun freeze combo to quickly kill off a target, but that's a pretty niche scenario. One positive is that the ability does feature a 25% damage amp and comes with 2 charges, which does bump it up a notch in our eyes. All that taken into account, Unstable Mosquito is slightly above average, which is why it's getting a B rank. Next on the list is Ward of the Damned, which increases movement speed by 10% and blocks melee and projectile attacks in front of you for 2 seconds. Each absorbed attack summons a skeleton, and enemy attackers are knocked backwards. This ability is also unlocked when you defeat Nikolaus the Fallen in the Forgotten Cemetery in Farbane Woods. Shields are powerful in V Rising, so let's get that out of the way right now. But they're not all created equal. In this case, Ward of the Damned is most effective when used in a high mob density situation. The more attacks that sink into that 2-second shield, the more skeleton soldiers you get fighting on your side, and that's part of the allure of the ability. Ward of the Damned also has a relatively low cooldown, which allows you to use it more frequently, which is great in PvP when dealing with aggressive attackers. Sadly, if a player has any modicum of self-control, the chance of this shield playing a huge factor in a PvP encounter falls quite a bit. Also consider that the skeleton soldiers don't really factor into PvP, so we're really only looking at a few strong strengths as well as some obvious weaknesses. That being said, shields are still decently strong in the game, and to that end, we're giving Ward of the Damned a B rank. Moving down to our travel skill, Veil of Bones. This allows players to dash towards a direction, eluding nearby enemies for 2.2 seconds. Your next attack launches a projectile that deals 25% magic damage, bouncing up to 4 targets and inflicting Amplify that increases damage taken by 25% for 5 seconds. Veil of Bones is the second ability unlocked when players defeat Goreswine the Ravager. In my opinion, Veil of Bones is one of the better travel skills in the game. What it boils down to is simply this. The projectile you get from landing your first hit after the dash bounces to 4 targets, applying that damage amp debuff, which might be one of the most efficient ways to spread it around. Thinking through some of the scenarios where multiple enemies might be a problem, this is a huge selling point for the ability. You do have to land that first hit, and if you miss, you lose out on the effect, but that alone makes Veil of Bones stand out as a superb ability, which is why it's getting an A rank. Moving on to the first of 2 Unholy ultimate abilities. Summon Fallen Angel allows you to summon an avatar to fight by you for 15 seconds. Attacks made by the Fallen Angel inflict Amplify that increases damage taken by 25%. To unlock this ability, you need to defeat Solaris the Immaculate, the final V-Blood unit currently in V Rising. Summons are always an interesting topic in video games. Some players love them, others hate them, but it always comes back to a few things. 1, is the AI competent enough, and 2, is their value. Actual value summoning a minion over using a more direct ability. In this case, I think Stunlock does a good job making the Fallen Angel feel impactful. 15 seconds is a very generous ultimate timer compared to others in the game, which already helps the ability stand out. The Angel also actively chases enemies, making it hard for them to avoid any of her attacks, and more often than not, she'll get at least 1 attack in on a target. Again, this ability causes damage amp, which is great, and for those of you that engage in PvP, especially on a 4-person server, the Fallen Angel does work in close quarters, such as inside a castle. It's a great ability. It just sucks that you only get it after defeating the final boss. That doesn't take away from its potency, just a reflection, and of course, Summon Fallen Angel gets an A rank. The second Unholy ultimate and final ability in the tree is Volatile Arachnid. When cast, this summons spiderlings that chase down your enemies and explode when nearby, dealing 100% magic damage. The explosion also spawns a toxic fume that deals 20% magic damage every 0.8 seconds, while also slowing enemies by 25%. To get Volatile Arachnid, you need to defeat the V-Blood unit Ungora the Spider Queen at the end of the Spider Cave in the Cursed Forest. Volatile Arachnid sounds pretty awesome. You get 3 charges of exploding spiders that you can use to deal decent AoE ticking damage, and that sounds like a winner. The only real issue is that these spiders are actually pretty easy to avoid, and that makes the ability less viable in all situations across the PvE and PvP spectrum. What's good is the damage and the lingering effects, which makes a noticeable impact in PvE play, but in PvP situations the ability just doesn't perform. Again, if a target is stunned or incapacitated, that's a different story, but if you're going toe-to-toe with some really talented brawlers, then the ability loses its punch. Sadly, there's not much more to say on the topic. It's a middle-of-the-road average ability, which is why Volatile Arachnid is getting a C rank. The first ability on the list is Crystal Lance. When cast, players launch a projectile dealing 150% magic damage and inflicting chill. Hitting a chilled enemy freezes it for 4 seconds. The Crystal Lance splinters into a nova of projectiles on impact, and each splinter deals 50% magic damage, chilling or freezing targets as well. Enemy vampires are frozen for 2.5 seconds. Crystal Lance is unlocked after killing the V-Blood unit Merrowin the Elementalist in Silverlight Hills. She's technically an endgame boss, so don't expect to get this ability too quickly. Crystal Lance is powerful, and that 150% magic damage scales nicely, but in terms of benefits that matter, well, that's really all there is to talk about with this ability. Crystal Lance is decent enough as a straight-line projectile, but if you put some logic behind it, the spell just doesn't have enough practical usability. The real issue is the long cast time and nova of projectiles. In PvP, a long cast time means a few things. 1, an ability is easy to predict, and 2, you're locked into a cast animation slowing you down. Those 2 things alone are bad enough, but factor in the ability's secondary effect, the nova of projectiles, and sadly, Crystal Lance just isn't that great. The issue here is that the projectiles don't often hit anything, and unless you're really smart and skillful with your casts, the impact of those additional missiles is next to none. Sadly, Crystal Lance just doesn't have a lot of practical use, which is why it's getting a C rank. Next on our list is Frost Barrier. This shield increases movement speed by 10% and blocks melee and projectile attacks in front of you for 2 seconds. It also spawns up to 8 waves of frost, dealing 50% magic damage and inflicting chill when the barrier is struck. To unlock Frost Barrier, you need to kill the V-Blood unit Vincent the Frostbringer, who can be found patrolling the roads of the Dunley farmlands. I highly recommend tracking him at the Blood Altar since he covers quite a bit of ground. As we talked about in our Unholy abilities ranking video, shields are incredibly powerful. Frost Barrier is really no exception. The damage component, those waves of frost, in conjunction with the chill effect, is a strikingly good combination. In both PvE and PvP, it performs well, and if you lean into a frost build, you can really capitalize on that chilled effect. If used correctly, the shield is also hard to dodge. This isn't like a skeleton that you can simply run away from. The waves of frost that spawn are designed well, and if something hits the shield, the enemy will most likely pay the price. Ultimately, this is a great ability that functions well across the board and checks off a lot of boxes, which is why it's getting an A rank. Next on our list is Frostbat. When cast, players launch a projectile that explodes upon impact, dealing 100% magic damage and inflicting chill on surrounding enemies. Hitting a chilled enemy freezes it for 4 seconds, and enemy vampires that are hit are frozen for 2.5 seconds. To unlock Frostbat, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Keely the Frost Archer in the far east of Farbane Woods. Frostbat is an all-around solid frost skill, and while it may not have a ton of flash, it's got a lot of substance. First off, it's near instant cast. It's a lot more valuable in both PvE and PvP, which gives the ability an edge over Crystal Lance. Also, you get 2 charges, which is good for a number of reasons. Chief among them, you can use this one skill to inflict chill and freeze if you land both shots. There's also an AoE component that's easy to land, which is always nice in both PvE and PvP. And finally, if you really lean into the Frost Tree, Frostbat fits in nicely as a spell that can really lay the foundation for a more powerful build. With all that in mind, if it wasn't already clear, Frostbat is a great spell, which is why it's getting an A rank. Changing gears, let's talk about Ice Nova. When cast, players summon a Nova of Ice at the target location, dealing 100% magic damage and freezing any enemy already affected by chill for 4 seconds. The Nova radiates outward, inflicting chill for 5 seconds to any enemy hit. Enemy vampires are frozen for 2.5 seconds. To unlock Ice Nova, players need to kill the V-Blood unit, Frostmaw the Mountain Terror, and the Hollowed Mountains. Since the Hollowed Mountains aren't complete at the time of making this video, the boss's location could potentially change in the future. Ice Nova is another Frost ability that seems great on paper, but just a few too many things hold it back from being truly awesome. Sadly, it doesn't get any magic amp, which keeps its damage relatively low. It's also a fairly easy ability to spot. Luckily, the instant cast and quick ramp-up time makes this a relatively small issue. Where it does excel is impact. Because of its large AoE, you can really catch multiple players or groups of enemies off guard, which allows you to set up an engagement or slow down foes enough to get away. Ideally, you use this as a follow-up skill to an already chilled opponent, which makes us feel like it truly needs to be used in conjunction with something else to make any sort of meaningful impact in a fight, and just doesn't stand up on its own, which is why Ice Nova is getting a B rank. The Frost Travel skill, Veil of Frost, allows players to dash towards a given direction, elude nearby enemies for 2.2 seconds, and apply a self-shield for 125% of their spell power. Their next primary attack deals 25% bonus damage and conjures a Nova of Frost, dealing 50% magic damage and inflicting chill on nearby enemies. Veil of Frost is also unlocked when killing the V-Blood unit Vincent the Frostbringer in the Dunley Farmlands. Veil of Frost is a powerful travel skill, one of the better options in the game. Because of its unique effect, it gives players the flexibility to use it as an offensive move for inflicting chill or triggering the final component of freeze, or a defensive tool by using it just before getting hit or absorbing a dot effect entirely. The Stunlock team was pretty generous with the ability's effects, giving players a self-shield, bonus damage, and a magic component, but you do lose a little something, the ability to reposition with a recast. That being said, Veil of Frost is a powerful option that stands up well in PvE, PvP, in a Frost build, or on its own, which is why it's getting an A rank. Our first Frost ultimate is Arctic Leap. When cast, players leap into the air and strike down at a target location, dealing 225% magic damage. A Nova of Frost erupts from the impact location, freezing any enemies hit for up to 6 seconds, and of course enemy vampires are frozen for half of that, 3 seconds. To unlock this ability, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Terrorclaw the Ogre in the Hollowed Mountains. Again, because this zone isn't complete, this boss might be relocated during development. If there were a meta ultimate in B-Rising's PvE, it would be Arctic Leap. The damage is remarkably high and scales accordingly. In most situations, it obliterates mobs, but also has the added value of being able to control enemy movement with its freeze effect. The impact is where you get the damage and the initial chill effect, but the control comes because of the expanding Frost Nova. You get both sides of the coin, and while the ability isn't quite as powerful by itself in PvP, mainly due to its easy-to-spot animation, when it's executed correctly as a follow-up to its Incapacitate, the impact is massive and leads to chain stun combos. It's also as close to perfect an ultimate as you'll find in the game, which is why Arctic Leap is getting an S rank. Our last Frost ability is Frost Vortex. When cast, players conjure a Frost Storm that deals 100% magic damage and pulls enemies towards the center. The storm rages on for 6 seconds, dealing 480% magic damage and inflicting chill on all enemies. To unlock Frost Vortex, you'll need to kill the endgame V-Blood unit, the Winged Terror. To reach this enemy, you'll need to kill Night Marshal Sticks in the Cursed Forest to obtain Bat Form. Use Bat Form, fly to the Winged Terror's location, and kill the boss. On paper, Frost Vortex seems all-powerful, with incredibly high damage that scales well. The issue is, the ability really only has potency in PvE. The issue in PvP is that Frost Vortex is easy to avoid, even without a travel skill available. If used correctly, or if you manage to catch enemies off guard, the skill can make a serious impact, but there is a secondary animation that has a bit of a false start, once again allowing players to escape. Luckily, the high damage and large AoE save this ultimate from being a total bust, and its PvE potency is good enough, but sadly, there's just a few too many things holding it back, which is why Frost Vortex gets a C rank. First up in the illusion skill tree is Trance. When activated, players block melee and projectile attacks for up to 1.5 seconds. Players also turn non-material and teleport to the cursor location when an attack is blocked. This also resets the cooldown of your secondary weapon attack. To unlock Trance, players need to kill Foul Rot the Soul Taker in the Cursed Forest. He can be found in the ancient village in the eastern part of the area. For an ability unlocked so late into the V-Blood progression, I personally feel like Trance should just do a bit more. There's something to be said about an ability that allows you to go invulnerable for any period of time, but when the payoff is simply the ability to reposition and resetting a weapon cooldown, I start thinking about how it stacks up against similar moves in the game. There is value to being able to reposition after an enemy attack, and using the spell to completely negate an enemy's move is a strong benefit, but without an additional utility, it lags behind other, more powerful abilities that function in a similar way. What I will acknowledge is that there is viability in PvP, and as Livid pointed out in our conversation about all of these moves, this is one of the go-to high-end PvP skills. But if we remember back to our Groundrules, usability in PvE, PvP, and utility, it brings a decent amount to the table, it just doesn't go all the way. With that in mind, Miss Trance is getting a B rank. I do want to point out that Livid doesn't quite agree with this rank and believes the ability should be an A tier. Next on our list is Spectral Assassin. When cast, players summon a Spectral Assassin at a targeted location that performs a heavy melee attack, dealing 125% magic damage to nearby enemies, knocking them back and weakening them, reducing damage output by 30% for 5 seconds. To unlock this ability, players need to kill Leandra, the Shadow Priestess in the Dunley farmlands. She can be found up the hill at the altar in the Church of the Damned in the northern part of the area. Spectral Assassin is a really unique ability, one that I think could be rather good with some work. The mechanics of the spell are solid when they actually work. Oftentimes, when you summon the assassin, it fails to hit anything, because by the time the unit is summoned, winds up its swing, and actually executes the swing, enemies have moved. There's almost a skill shot component to an ability that clearly shouldn't be a skill shot, and if it was intended that way, it needs some work. That being said, in its current form, it's not a bad ability, just not great. The damage could be higher, but the knockback and weakening are both great aspects of the spell, which is why Spectral Assassin is getting a C rank. Moving right along, let's talk about Spectral Wolf. When cast, players send out a Spectral Wolf in a straight line, dealing 100% magic damage, inflicting a fading snare, and weakening the target, reducing the damage output by 30% for 5 seconds. This ability bounces up to 2 nearby enemies, but deals 75% less damage per hit. To unlock this ability, players need to kill Pelora the Feywalker in Western Farbane Woods. This V-Blood unit can be found in the Gleaming Meadows. Spectral Wolf is the first of the illusion abilities on the list that I truly think is good. Let's be clear though, you're not really using this ability for its damage. Because it doesn't crack 100%, you're not getting magic scaling, which means long term, the damage is going to seriously lag behind. What you do get, however, is a really solid utility spell that performs well in PvE and PvP. Both the Fading Snare and Weakening are good, but you factor in the spell's ability to bounce targets, and that really seals the deal. Unfortunately, because the damage component lags behind, it holds back Spectral Wolf from being a truly great ability, which is why it's getting a B rank. Our next illusion ability is Wisp Dance, another interesting spell within the tree. When cast, players summon 3 wisps that circle around them, dealing 25% magic damage to enemies hit. Players can recast the spell to launch all 3 wisps as projectiles, dealing 50% magic damage and weakening the target, reducing damage output by 30% for 5 seconds. To unlock Wisp Dance, players need to kill Gore Crusher the Behemoth in the Cursed Forest. This is one of the final V-Blood units currently in the game that can be found in the lair of the Behemoth. For killing such a powerful enemy, you'd think you'd get a more powerful spell, but sadly, Wisp Dance fails to impress in nearly every situation. The ability just isn't great, and it largely comes down to its lackluster damage. Couple that with the fact that you need to spend pretty much every second up in an enemy's face while the orbs are active to make any sort of impact, and you're pretty much setting yourself up to fail. Again, really cool ability on paper, and I applaud the team for trying something different, but to get this spell in line with some of the other more meta offerings in the game, they need to take this one back to the drawing board. With that in mind, Wisp Dance is getting a D rank. Moving on to our travel skill, Veil of Illusion. When cast, players dash in a given direction, eluding nearby enemies for 2.2 seconds. Players' next primary attack also deals 25% bonus damage. When cast, players also spawn an illusion that throws a projectile, dealing 40% magic damage. Veil of Illusion can be recast, returning players to the start position and spawning a new illusion at the current location. Veil of Illusion is unlocked when players kill Pelora the Feywalker in Farbane Woods. This is the second ability unlocked when killing this boss. Let's get one thing out of the way right off the bat. Veil of Illusion's biggest strength is in its flexibility to recast. This is a valuable component in both PvE and PvP, and proves to be one of the biggest selling points of the skill. Being able to keep your enemies guessing as you engage in a duel has a lot of value, and thus makes the move really stand out from that perspective. However, that's really where the good stuff stops and the mediocre stuff begins. Veil of Illusion just doesn't really do enough to be that impressive. The 25% bonus damage is paltry, and the summoned illusion is a joke, barely doing any sort of meaningful damage. Again, the spell's single biggest benefit is in its recast and the ability to reposition, but aside from that, it doesn't stack up against some of the better travel skills in the game that do more to aid players in both PvP and PvE. With that in mind, Veil of Illusion is getting a B rank. Once again, Livid doesn't quite agree with this ranking and believes Veil of Illusion is more of an A tier or even possibly an S tier. Our first illusion ultimate ability is Mirror Strike. When cast, players dash forward and bounce between nearby enemies, striking them for a total of 600% magic damage split evenly across targets within the area over 3 seconds. Enemies hit are also weakened by 30% for 5 seconds. Once over, players dash towards their aim direction. This ability is unlocked by defeating Octavian, the militia captain, in the Dunley farmlands. He's a tricky boss, one that our team felt would be a pretty big hurdle for players, but luckily the reward fits the effort required to kill him. Mirror Strike truly saves the illusion tree from being a total dud. This is a really fun ability that once again showcases the developer's ability to think a little differently about their spells and abilities within the game. The real selling point here is twofold: the sheer damage potential and the overall ease of which players can pull off the move. 600% is just a lot of damage and really makes the ability feel impactful. In both PvE and PvP, this ultimate feels, well, ultimate, and that's always a good barometer for if the team has done a decent job designing an ability of this caliber. The second aspect of the skill that I really like is its ease of use. As long as you hit an enemy, the ability pretty much does the rest, providing players with an almost set and forget mentality. It's a great ability, one that I believe players should consider in their builds, and to that effect, Mirror Strike is getting an A rank. Our final illusion skill is Spectral Guardian, the second ultimate in the tree. When cast, players summon a Spectral Guardian that shields allies in an area for 125% of the player's spell power. It also attacks enemies with powerful swings. The defensive shield is reapplied every 1.5 seconds, and the Guardian lasts 7 seconds. To unlock the Spectral Guardian, players need to kill Terra, the Geomancer, in the northwest portion of the Dunley farmlands. She can be found isolated at Bedrock Pass. I hate to say it, but we're ending with a dud. Spectral Guardian is easily one of the worst ultimate abilities in the game, and I can't think of a single player that would take this over the array of other, more powerful abilities. I like the concept, a Guardian that provides a defensive boost to players, but those effects aren't felt for as short a time as the Guardian is active. Something isn't quite right with this spell, and whether it's the potency of the shields or the overall length of the summon, it's impossible to compare this next to nearly any other ultimate and think they're in the same league. What I will say is that Spectral Guardian does have some value in PvP in some niche scenarios, especially when players are engaging in groups. But outside of that, I can't imagine any player making an argument that this is a good ability. Maybe I'm wrong, and you can all let me know in the comments, but when push comes to shove, we're giving Spectral Guardian a C rank. Our first Chaos ability is Aftershock. Players smash the ground, causing a shockwave that erupts, dealing 100% magic damage in a line and inflicting Chaos Burn. To unlock Aftershock, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Errol the Stonebreaker and the Copper Mine in Farbane Woods. This is a relatively early game target within the grand scope of the game. Right out of the gate, we have an okay Chaos ability. Aftershock is a great intro into the skill tree, and its emphasis on damage first, defense later. The ability does have some strengths. It's solid in tight corridors, which makes it great when sieging or defending a castle, but it also has an AoE component, which of course is always a plus. The ability also triggers the Chaos Burn dot, which not only chips away at an enemy's health pool over time, as long as the dot is active, it keeps the enemy in combat and makes it much harder for them to heal. That's really more of a PvP angle, but that dot does provide some nice damage in PvE as well. While the ability is easy and fun to use, it's not the most impactful. Its 100% magic damage doesn't scale well in the endgame, and because of its clear telegraph, it's less than ideal in PvP, making it easy for more skilled players to avoid. That being said, it's not a bad ability, which is why Aftershock is getting a C rank. Next on our list is Chaos Barrier. When cast, players' movement speed is increased by 10%. Players also block melee and projectile attacks in front of them for 2 seconds. Blocking an attack launches a projectile towards the attacker, dealing 75% damage, pushing the target towards you, and inflicting Chaos Burn. The cooldown of the spell is 9 seconds. To unlock Chaos Barrier, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Quincy the Bandit King in central Farbane Woods. As far as defensive abilities go, Chaos Barrier pretty much takes the cake. Remember, we have to consider PvE, PvP, and utility implications, and to that end, this move gets the job done. First off, you're getting some bonus movement speed, which is good. As a barrier, it also blocks all melee and projectile attacks, and that's also good. The real magic, what makes this ability a cut above the rest, is everything else it brings to the table. First, the fact that you can reflect attacks back at an enemy for surprisingly good damage. 75% doesn't seem like much, but the damage feels impactful regardless of what the tooltip says. Chaos Barrier's ability to pull enemies closer is also a huge advantage in PvP and makes engaging that much easier, especially if you're an aggressive player. Finally, and we can't forget this, those reflected projectiles also apply Chaos Burn, which is consequential for reasons we outlined before. Top to bottom, Chaos Barrier is hands down the best defensive ability in the game using our rubric for grading, and while it does have some small limitations, things like failing to protect against AoE abilities and attacks from the sides, all barrier spells deal with the same issues. At the end of the day, the spell is great, which is why Chaos Barrier is getting an S rank. Next up, we have Chaos Volley. When cast, players launch 2 Chaos Bolts in a sequence that deal 125% magic damage and inflict Chaos Burn. To unlock Chaos Volley, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Lydia the Chaos Archer in Farbane Woods. She patrols along a set path in the eastern part of the region, so it's best to track her using the Blood Altar. Well, we've finally come to it, the best ability in V Rising. Sure, that is subjective, but across the community, you'll find everyone, and I do mean pretty much everyone, rants and raves about the potency of this spell. There's a couple things to consider. First off, Chaos Volley provides great poke, allowing players to deal significant damage from mid-range. You do get 2 attacks per cast, which also sweetens the deal because it just means more damage potential. The spell has a relatively short cooldown, the projectiles inflict Chaos Burn, and Chaos Volley scales well in the endgame. PvE or PvP, it really doesn't matter. This spell is about as meta as it gets, providing incredible damage, harass potential, and utility with its dot. Sure, there's a bit of a wind-up, which is easy to spot in PvP, but because you can continue to target while winding up, it hardly matters. Chaos Volley is a stellar spell, one of the best in the game, which is why it's getting an S rank. Our next Chaos ability is Power Surge. When cast, it removes all negative effects and applies a 4-second shield on the player or chosen ally. It also shields the target for 150% of the casting player's spell power and increases the movement speed and attack speed by 25% while the shield is active. To unlock this ability, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Azariel the Sunbringer in Silverlight Hills. Whoever designed the Chaos skill tree clearly needs to tone it down a notch, because once again, we have another stellar spell. While defensive in nature, you won't find a similar move in the game that even comes close to providing this much benefit across the board. You've got a powerful shield, a buff to movement and attack speed, a negative effect purge, and can't forget this, the ability to cast the spell on an ally. Power Surge checks off all the boxes and then some, and really provides top to bottom benefits for solo players, groups of players, and in both PvE and PvP. If you're not really a melee-focused player, you don't quite see as many benefits, but that hardly matters because the rest of its boons make up for that small shortcoming. If you haven't worked Power Surge into a build, I highly recommend you test it out because it's truly a one-of-a-kind ability within the game, and to that end, Power Surge is getting an S rank. Next up, we have Void. When cast, players summon an orb that explodes at the targeted location, dealing 70% magic damage and inflicting Chaos Burn. This skill comes with 2 charges, and each charge has a 9-second cooldown. Be aware, this skill also pushes enemies in whatever direction of the AoE they're standing in. Void is unlocked when players kill the V-Blood unit Morian the Stormwing Matriarch in Silverlight Hills. Void is a surprisingly good Chaos ability, one that gives players a lot of flexibility to control a fight. We do have to talk about the elephant in the room though, it's low damage, which, as you might expect, doesn't scale well in the endgame. That being said, some of the spell's other aspects do help keep it relevant longer into the game. The 2 charges offer players flexibility, and the Chaos Burn applied when hitting an enemy is good, as we've discussed a few times already. The spell also covers a sizable area, doesn't have a long ramp-up time before detonation, and just feels rather snappy for a point-and-click AoE explosion. It's a sleek spell design, but there's one thing that really disrupts the balance: the spell's knockback. It's a bit overpowering, and in team play really causes some issues with combos. Even in PvE where you might be going alone, the knockback is just a bit odd for an ability that's meant to be used at range, but I'm sure skilled players can adjust and make the most of it. Void is a solid spell, one that's fun to use, and for that reason, it's getting a B rank. Moving on to our travel skill, Veil of Chaos. When cast, players dash towards a given direction and elude nearby enemies for 2.2 seconds. Player's next melee attack deals 25% bonus damage, and the spell can be recast to dash once more, spawning a second illusion. Your illusions explode, dealing 50% magic damage to all nearby enemies. To unlock Veil of Chaos, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Clive the Firestarter in the southwest corner of Farbane Woods. If it's not already clear, the Chaos skills lean heavy into damage, but there's still a ton of utility with Veil of Chaos that's worth pointing out. Unlike its illusion counterpart, when you recast the spell, you don't go back to the starting point. Instead, players get a second dash towards whatever direction they want. The range is shorter. The devs are pretty smart about that, but still, the ability to quickly juke one way then the other is powerful. The ability's 25% damage bonus also synergizes well with Rogue Blood. While we haven't really discussed Blood in our rankings, it's hard to ignore the fact that you can dash, attack, and lean into the crit effect. Veil of Chaos also comes with that additional explosive component, which can be utilized twice, and in the right scenario, provide even more damage. It's all about the deeps in this case, and while the spell doesn't have any real defensive capabilities, the offensive benefits make up for it, and then some. With all that in mind, Veil of Chaos is getting an A rank. Our first Chaos ultimate is Chaos Barrage. When cast, players launch 4 Chaos Orbs that deal 75% magic damage on direct hit, 75% magic damage to enemies in an area, and everything inflicts Chaos Burn. To unlock Chaos Barrage, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Jade the Vampire Hunter in the Dunley Farmlands. This is a patrolling enemy, so it's best to use a Blood Altar to track her location. If you like Chaos Volley, then think of Chaos Barrage as the evolution. Sadly, not all evolution is good in every situation. There's a lot to be said for its impact. 4 projectiles that, when on target, deal considerable damage, even if the spell scaling isn't great. The problem is, you're immobile during casting, which is a huge issue in PvP. The spell leaves you open for attack, and if you trigger it at the wrong time, you're pretty much a sitting duck. The spell is also incredibly easy to spot and avoid, which makes it a bit of a letdown when you consider our requirements for grading. What I will say though is that the spell does function well in PvE, and is a fun one to use when killing some of the endgame V-Blood units, especially if you like fighting at range. Sadly, Chaos Barrage just doesn't check off enough boxes, and the cracks in the foundation really hold it back, which is why it's getting a C rank. Our final Chaos ability is Merciless Charge. When cast, players charge forward and grab an enemy, dealing 125% magic damage, pushing them in front of the player. This deals 100% magic area damage and inflicts a stun lasting 1.5 seconds when reaching maximum range or when colliding with another enemy or object. To unlock Merciless Charge, players need to kill the V-Blood unit Quincy the Bandit King in central Farbane Woods. Merciless Charge is a really interesting ability. At first glance, it's a simple line charge attack that deals decent damage, but when you unpack it, especially considering both PvE and PvP, it becomes a lot more enticing. The real selling point is in its flexibility to reposition. Whether engaging an enemy or disengaging from a fight, Merciless Charge provides you with options. In PvE, you can use it to avoid an attack or simply deal damage. In PvP, it's much more potent, allowing you to chase a player, avoid taking damage, or even use it to peel enemies away from a fight, setting up your team for a different dynamic. What I'm getting at is that it's a flexible spell that may not sound ultimate on paper, but when you think through the application, is pretty impressive. Merciless Charge is a solid ability, which is why it's getting an A rank. And there you have it, every ability currently in V-Rising ranked. If you're still with us for the ride, well done. I know that was a dense video, but like we said during the intro, we wanted to have a singular resource for new players interested in learning more about the robust set of abilities and spells available to use. As always, if you guys appreciate the work we put into bringing every video to life, we need your support. Hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. It's still the single best way to help channels like ours reach new audiences. If you're interested in joining our V-Rising private server, consider joining us on Discord. We've got a small PvP server set up with 2x resources for anyone to use. Just check out the link below and join today. Finally, if you like everything we're doing here on the channel and you want to support us even more, consider becoming a member. For just a few bucks, you're helping Livid and I achieve our dreams of becoming full-time content creators. Check out the join button below to learn more. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.